In the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Today I want to talk about, competence, performance, and their relationship to, I language, E language. If you actually go to page 15, you will see that it is written something like a the new paragraph on page 15 line, I suppose it's about the new paragraph beginning with the influential distinction. Okay, you will see that the influential distinction between competence and performance first drawn in Chomsky 1965. So what is competence and what is performance? We want to talk about these two things. Okay, to Chomsky, as I told you in my previous presentation, it was something that competence is everything and performance is going to be something derived version of language. Okay, so Chomsky takes care of competence and says that performance is not so important. Okay, so if you want to know the distinction, it is something like this. As I told you, competence is important, performance is trivial, not important. So you can read something like this. The influential distinction between competence and performance partly corresponds to I language versus E language split. Okay, so if you actually go to the next paragraph, you have the definition of competence. Okay, let us start with Chomsky's definition of competence, the paragraph in the middle of page 15. Chomsky says, by grammatical competence, I mean the cognitive state that encompasses all those aspects of form and meaning and their relationship, including underlying structures that enter into the relation, which are properly assigned to the specific subsystems of human mind that relates representations of form and meaning. So this is what Chomsky means by competence. Well, simply as I told you last week, competence means the ability to, the knowledge, the ability to talk. Well, if you actually go to page 19, down the page, you will see something like this. Competence is the speaker hearer's knowledge of his language, okay, according to Chomsky 1965. This is what we say that we have got language. We say that we have got language. And what is language? Language is this kind of competence that we have. Okay, if you actually go back to page 15, you will see that competence is everything and performance is something that is different in different situations. For example, if you go under a surgery, as I told you, you will have competence but no performance. You cannot talk, so you cannot have performance. Okay, but your knowledge remains constant here. Okay, when you are tired, again, when you are tired, you have the full competence, but there is no performance, but there is no good performance. So this is something like this. So what is performance? Performance simply means that we are using something called performance, something called competence in order to say something in everyday speech. So this is the distinction between competence, as you see on page 19, the speaker here knowledge of his language, and performance is the opposite one, the actual use of language in concrete situations. So I am performing, as I told you earlier, okay? I am performing. Why? I am using my knowledge of language. I'm using my competence to say something, okay? This is competence and performance. Well, back to page 15, we see that this kind of understanding by Chomsky, this kind of conception by Chomsky, this kind of idea by Chomsky has been the subject of attacks. Okay, so if you actually go to the two lines at the bottom of this page, you can find something like, well, Chomsky's notion of competence has sometimes been attacked for failing to deal with how language is used. So sort of performance, okay? And the concept of communicative competence actually has been proposed. Chomsky says everything is like competence and performance. They say no, competence is not good. Well, we are going to say something instead. They introduce the notion of communicative competence. This is the question that one of my students asked me, okay? And I am asking his question now, okay? So it actually in 1972, Himes, page 16, says, line 1, says that, we have something called the communicative competence, okay? So this is important. So it is a kind of reaction to the original notion of competence by Chomsky. Why? Because when Chomsky talks about competence, he actually means something in the mind about the language, okay? But they say language needs to be looked at from another perspective, and that is communication. Okay, we communicate with each other. So Himes 1972 introduced this notion. Okay, so for example, when you actually say something like sentence 13 on page 16, can you lift that box? Can you lift that box? You don't only want to know something, you ask a kind of communicative, in fact, kind of thing when you say something like, can you lift that box? It means that are you able? It is more than, of course, are you able? It means that I want to ask you to, in fact, pull up that box. Okay? So it is not part of the meaning of that kind of thing. In fact, we use it in such a way that we introduce pragmatics here. Okay? So, can you lift that box is not asking the ability of you to lift a kind of box. No, it is a kind of asking you. It's a kind of asking you. It's a kind of request to, in fact, pull up something called a box. Okay, so sentence 13 on page 16, okay, has got two types of meanings. One surface, shallow Chomskyan meaning. Can you lift that box? It means, are you able to lift that box? But by 13, we mean something else. We mean it's a kind of request. When you want somebody to, in fact, do something for you, for example, lifting the box, you say something like, can you lift the box? So in this sense, It's a kind of new sense, a pragmatic sense is introduced. Okay, so because of these kinds of communicative, in fact, aspects of language by Harms 1972, Chomsky actually came to talk about something called pragmatic competence in order to include these aspects. Okay, so if you actually go back to page 19 again once more, you see that we have in the box on page 19 we have pragmatic competence places language in the institutional setting of its use, relating intentions and purposes to the linguistic means at hand. So your intention here, your purpose here is not to ask a kind of question, can you lift the box? Your intention is important. What is your intention? Your intention is something like this, okay, you want a kind of you are requesting something. You are requesting something. You're asking somebody to do something for you. Well, this is what we mean by pragmatic competence and things like that on page 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19. So I'm just repeating once more. Well, first of all, Chomsky had two notions, competence and performance. Okay? And Chomsky said that competence is important, performance is not that important. Others said no, it is performance again is important in that we want to know things like, for example, communication. So, for example, because of that, Harms introduced communicative competence to include these matters that are not taken care of by Chomsky. Okay, so we introduce communicative competence on page, as I see on top of page 16. Next, when introduced these kinds of notions, this kind of notion, communicative competence, Chomsky, in fact, revised his idea and said that we have something like, in fact, we have something like pragmatic competence as well. So this is an introduction of working on pragmatic competence as well. Okay, the results appear on page 19, on the box on page 19. But actually, Chomskyan approaches continue to talk about two things still. One thing is competence, the other is performance. So things that we are talking about, like communicative competence, like pragmatic competence, like strategic competence last week, are taken care of by those groups of, in fact, those groups of scholars like non-Chomskyan ones, the E-language approach. This is against Chomsky's ideas. Thank you very much. I'm just finishing this part.